Fear the eagle, the world had never seen a power like Rome. Its legions stretched from the cold forests of Germania to the burning sands of Egypt. And wherever the eagle standard was raised, one message was clear: resistance was suicide. But what made Rome so terrifying wasn't just its armies. It was its response to rebellion. Every empire faces uprisings, but Rome crushed them with a precision so ruthless, so methodical, that their enemies were not just defeated, they were erased. Imagine being a rebel, watching the horizon darken with armored soldiers marching in perfect formation, their shields locked, their discipline unshaken. You might outnumber them, you might even win a battle, but Rome never forgot, Rome never forgave, and Rome always returned. For centuries, revolt after revolt sparked across the empire, from slaves in Italy to zealots in Judea, and each one ended the same way, with blood, fire, and silence. This is the hidden system behind Rome's unbreakable grip on its empire, not luck, not chance, but ruthless precision. Today, we uncover how Rome crushed rebellions so decisively that even centuries later, their enemies remembered not just the defeat, but the terror. The Roman way of control. Rome did not rule its empire by chance or sheer brutality alone. It ruled by design. At the heart of Roman dominance was control, woven into every layer of society. Provinces were bound not just by roads and legions, but by laws, taxes, and fear. Rome understood that rebellion was not born from chaos but from hope that revolt could succeed. To destroy that hope, Rome built a system that combined discipline, administration, and terror. The Roman legions were the ultimate tool of this machine. Unlike tribal warriors who fought with passion and impulse, Rome's soldiers fought as one body, trained to obey without hesitation, conditioned to stand firm even when surrounded. Behind them stood governors who enforced Roman law, collecting tribute and crushing dissent before it spread. Even Rome's gifts, aqueducts, amphitheaters, markets, served as chains of loyalty, reminding subjects of what Rome could give, and what Rome could take away. Yet when loyalty failed, Rome showed no mercy. Whole villages were burned, thousands enslaved, leaders publicly executed. These acts were not random punishments, they were deliberate lessons. Every revolt, no matter how small, became a spectacle of Roman might, a performance meant to echo across provinces. This is what happens when you defy Rome, by combining order with terror. Rome made rebellion seem not only dangerous but hopeless, and that hopelessness was its greatest weapon, more powerful than swords or shields. This was the Roman way of control, not just crushing enemies, but shaping their very will to resist. The strategy of intimidation. When Rome faced rebellion, it didn't simply fight battles, it fought minds. Intimidation was as much a weapon as the gladius, and the legions wielded it with chilling precision. Marching in perfect formation, armored soldiers advanced like a living wall of iron, their shields glinting in the sun, their boots pounding in unison. To the rebels, it was not just an army, it was an unstoppable machine. But intimidation went beyond the battlefield. Rome mastered the art of public terror. When Spartacus led his slave revolt, the Romans responded with unimaginable cruelty. After crushing his army, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, miles of bodies nailed to crosses, rotting in the sun. A message to every slave: rise against Rome, and this will be your fate. In Judea, after crushing the Jewish revolt, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem's temple, the very heart of the people's identity, turning faith itself into ashes. In Gaul, entire tribes were slaughtered or sold into slavery. Their leaders paraded in chains through Rome's streets before being executed. This wasn't chaos. This was strategy. Rome knew that fear could spread faster than rebellion, that terror could choke resistance before it took root. Each act of brutality was carefully staged. Crucifixions placed on major roads, leaders executed in public squares, villages burned as warnings, and the lesson worked. For every province that dared rise, dozens more stayed silent, cowed by the memory of what Rome had done elsewhere. Through intimidation, Rome turned every act of defiance into a theater of despair. The empire didn't just win wars, it made sure its enemies never forgot how hopeless it was to fight. Divide and conquer. Rome's brilliance lay not only in the sword but in the mind. Rebellions often rose on the strength of unity, but Rome's answer was simple: break that unity before it became dangerous. The legions marched with steel, but behind them came the governors, diplomats, and spies, weaving webs of betrayal. Rome studied its enemies with ruthless patience, learning which tribes hated each other, which leaders craved power, which rivals could be bribed, and once they knew, they drove wedges deeper than any spear. In Gaul, Caesar perfected this method. He played tribe against tribe, convincing some chiefs to ally with Rome while others were crushed, ensuring that no united front ever stood against him. In the east, Rome promised kings their thrones if they betrayed their neighbors, turning ambition into a weapon sharper than any sword. Even among slaves and rebels, informants were bought with silver and promises of freedom, shattering trust from within. Rome's genius was that it didn't need to fight everyone. It only needed to make sure its enemies fought each other, and when divided foes turned on one another, the legions would arrive like wolves among sheep, finishing the slaughter with ease. To the world, it looked as though Rome was invincible, yet in truth, the empire's greatest victories were often won before a single blade was drawn. Divide and conquer was not just a tactic, it was the hidden skeleton of Roman power, a silent weapon that crushed rebellions before they could breathe. Where others sought glory in open battle, Rome sought certainty, dismantling resistance from within until there was nothing left but ashes and submission. Ruthless punishments when Rome crushed a rebellion. The war did not end on the battlefield, it ended in the minds of those who watched. Punishment was Rome's theater, staged for all to see, and it was as deliberate as any military maneuver. Rebellions were not merely defeated, they were made into warnings. Entire towns were burned to the ground, their ashes left as black scars on the landscape. Survivors were chained and marched in endless columns, paraded through Roman streets as living proof of what defiance cost. The most infamous was the crucifixion of Spartacus' followers. 6,000 slaves nailed 2 crosses along the Appian Way, their bodies stretching like a corridor of death for miles. For weeks travelers could see their suffering, a brutal message written in flesh and blood. This is what happens to those who rise against Rome. Sometimes the punishment was subtler but just as devastating. Heavy taxes, confiscated lands, forced relocations that uprooted whole families and erased cultures. To the Romans, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy, precision, and strategy. By making one rebellion a spectacle of pain, they prevented 10 others from sparking. The Senate understood that fear was stronger than any fortress wall, and generals wielded terror as carefully as their swords. And yet, in this merciless system, Rome's empire endured. Every crucifix, every razed village, every chained prisoner was a brick in the empire's foundation, a reminder that rebellion against Rome was not only hopeless, it was a death sentence written across generations. Through ruthless punishments, Rome did not just destroy its enemies, it taught the world obedience. The role of intelligence and spies, Rome's legions marched on iron discipline, but behind every campaign, unseen shadows paved the way. Intelligence gathering was the hidden blade of empire, the quiet weapon that crushed rebellions before swords were drawn. The Romans maintained vast networks of scouts, informants, and spies who slipped into enemy camps disguised as traders, slaves, or deserters. They listened in taverns, bribed chieftains, and mapped the movements of hostile tribes. Every whisper mattered. In Gaul, Caesar's victories were not won only with legions but with knowledge of rival alliances, tribal betrayals, and the terrain his enemies thought secret. In Judea, spies infiltrated rebel cells in the crowded streets of Jerusalem, feeding the Romans details of ambushes before they struck. Even messages carried by runners were intercepted, altered, and sent back to mislead entire armies. Rome turned information into a weapon sharper than steel. But this system was more than mere espionage. It was strategy woven into every campaign. Generals demanded constant reports, and decisions in battle often rested on a single scout's observation of enemy cavalry hidden in the hills. A rebellion could be strangled in its cradle if Rome knew who planned it, when they met, and where their loyalties faltered. Fear of spies spread paranoia among Rome's enemies, making alliances fragile and conspiracies dangerous to their own leaders. Rome's enemies fought in the open, but Rome often struck in the dark, prepared and unyielding, because it already knew the enemy's secrets. In this way, intelligence became the silent legion, one that marched unseen, but carried victories. Just as surely as any cohort on the battlefield, it was not just armies that crushed rebellions, it was the invisible hand of Rome's spies, reshaping the world from the shadows. Psychological warfare. Rome did not rely on steel alone. It wielded fear as a weapon, striking at the minds of its enemies before the first sword was drawn. When a rebellion erupted, the legions often marched with calculated brutality, designed to terrify not just the rebels but all who might dream of resistance. Defeated leaders were paraded in chains through conquered cities, their humiliation broadcast as a warning. Entire towns that dared defy Rome were sometimes razed to the ground, Their ruins left as silent monuments to Roman vengeance. Crucifixion became a symbol of Rome's dominance, with hundreds, even thousands of rebels hung along the roads leading into the empire's heartlands. A gruesome message carved into the landscape: defiance meant death, slow and public. But fear was not only inflicted through violence, it was also psychological theater. Rome staged triumphs in which captured kings and generals were displayed before cheering crowds, showing that no enemy, no matter how mighty, could escape the empire's grasp. In Gaul, Caesar's calculated mercy was as terrifying as his wrath, sparing some tribes while annihilating others, forcing survivors to wonder whether their loyalty would protect them or doom them. Psychological warfare seeped into diplomacy as well. The presence of a Roman legion encamped on the horizon often shattered rebellion before it began, because the sight of endless rows of shields, disciplined ranks, and the thunder of marching feet reminded all who opposed them that Rome was not merely an army, it was inevitability. By planting fear in the minds of both leaders and commoners, Rome controlled not only the battlefield but the very will of its enemies. In the end, the greatest rebellion crusher was not Rome's sword, but the dread of Rome itself. Psychological warfare. The ruthless genius of control. Rome's mastery over rebellions was not a matter of chance. It was a system, a ruthless, calculated machine of domination. Every act, from the discipline of its soldiers to the horrors it unleashed on the conquered, was designed to send one message: resistance was hopeless. The empire thrived not because rebellions never happened, but because they were crushed so thoroughly that the memory of defiance became a lesson carved into history itself. From the revolts of the Gauls to the fury of Spartacus, from Judea to Britannia, every uprising ended the same way, with Rome standing taller, its authority unshaken. Yet behind the brutality lay genius. Rome balanced fear with order, cruelty with integration. It gave conquered peoples roads, law, and prosperity, but only so long as they bent the knee. Those who embraced Roman rule found stability. Those who resisted found annihilation. This dual edge, the promise of peace and the certainty of destruction, was the empire's most powerful weapon. In crushing rebellions, Rome did more than win battles. It rewired the psychology of its subjects, teaching them that Rome was not merely a ruler but a force of nature, unyielding, eternal. It is why the empire endured for centuries, stretching its borders further than any city-state before it. In the end, the story of Rome's suppression of rebellions is not just one of violence, but of control, a dark brilliance in governance, where mercy and terror walked hand in hand. And that is the hidden truth. Rome's empire was not built on conquest alone, but on the crushing weight of inevitability, where to rise against Rome was to invite doom, and to live under Rome was to accept order under the shadow of the eagle.